The introduction. Yes, I consent to being recorded. Hello.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this evening. I do want to talk about different kinds of stories tonight. I want to talk about the title will tell you. Let me share my screen and bring you up to my PowerPoint. I want to talk about visions of the underworld and supernatural creatures in contemporary folk tales from Yucatan and also in the Popol Vuh. So let's see. Hopefully share this and get to where my PowerPoint is here. Let's see. Slideshow and oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Uh-oh. I want to go from the beginning. There we go. All right, so here's the picture at the beginning, which might be familiar to you guys. It's probably in your backyard. What I wanted to do first is bore you a little bit with my own personal story, and then tell you how these other kinds of stories come together. I first got interested in stories from Yucatan during the time when I started to do ethnobotanical research in the peninsula. So I was collecting plants and learning about how people use them. And my first Maya friends live about in the middle of the peninsula, right around Chichen. And as I was collecting plants, I started hearing snippets of stories and they were very intriguing to me. So, you know, I started hearing about all kinds of things and I started taking little notes on the side. And then I thought, you know, this really is a topic that deserves more attention than scribble scratch on the side. So many years later, I realized that I was hearing bits and pieces of what was pretty much a consistent body of folk tales, which mostly is an oral tradition, but there are written versions thereof. So I took a number of trips down to Merida and poked around in the library and found some written versions of things that I had heard. And then I guess what I'm doing is really kind of going backwards because I've gone from the very beginning, the contemporary moment, and I want to take you guys back in time to talk about literature from long ago. Obviously, the literature of the Maya world has a really long history. And although we might not get all of what the information was that the classic era Maya people carved into stone or painted onto deerskin codices in hieroglyphics, we do know that some of the imagery of the time depicts scenes that we can recognize from the very much later manuscript of the Popol Vuh, which is commonly referred to as the Maya Bible. It's not exactly right. It probably would be more accurate to call it the Council Book. Anyway, so my paper, this talk, explores how the underworld and its denizens appear in this book, the manuscript of the Popol Vuh, and also contemporary folktales. The version of the Popol Vuh that we have today comes down from the semi-anonymous Quiché Mayan authors who were writing in the 16th century in the highlands of Guatemala. Well, what's now Guatemala. And what they were trying to do was preserve a tradition which dated from a much earlier time, a time before the European incursions into their world started, and a time when the contents of the book may well have been written completely in hieroglyphics instead of the European alphabet. And you can, well, if you could see this thing, you could see it's Quiché on one side and Spanish on the other. All right, so the council book, the Popol Vuh. The In the early colonial period, the Spanish missionaries were busy burning as many hieroglyphic books as they could get their hands on. But they also taught the Maya people alphabetic writing. And the friars thought that this would be how their wards would spread the Christian word. And that happened, but the Maya people also used this new form of literacy for their own political and religious ends. And they created works of all different sorts, including the Chilam Balam books, the Ritual of the Bacabs, and the Popol Vuh in a European script. During the first years of the 18th century, there was a friar named Francisco Ximénez, and he made a copy of the Quiché text, and he added that Spanish translation. The book stayed, where did it stay? With the Dominicans for some time. Then it traveled to the University of San Carlos in Guatemala City. And then by circuitous routes, it went to Europe, and a couple versions were published there. And finally, it came back across the Atlantic to the Newberry Library in 1911. So Dennis Tedlock made an excellent translation of the Popol Vuh. I say it's excellent because he went down there to Guatemala and he learned how to speak the Quiché language, and he worked with local people who were experts in trying to make a translation instead of just kind of relying on other people's. He did his own, and again, working with somebody local is always good. Anyhow, in his introduction, he says, the advances in understanding the ancient Maya art have made it clearer than ever that many of the characters and events in the Popol Vuh have a deep past and were well known among the lowland Maya. Many people believe that the manuscript was used as a divinatory text, and that the stories that were told there may have been performed or reenacted periodically throughout the Mayan world. The book is it's complicated story. It tells many things. It tells from the beginning. It tells multiple creations of mankind. It tells really, it tracks, it explains movements of celestial bodies. It does a bunch of things on a different number of different levels. And it's very unsurprising that contemporary oral and written folk tales would have echoes or reflections of past literary traditions. So the Popol Vuh is a written version of what was once a sacred tradition. And you do see the continuity very clearly when you compare it to modern day Mayan conceptions of the underworld, the place of fear, which is Xibalba, and the supernaturals that are associated with it. In the Popol Vuh, there are these wonderful hero twins. I mean, you always have, in any good epic story, you have the forces of good and the forces of evil. So the hero twins are the good guys, and they go to the underworld numerous times. They confront the bad guys. They visit the dangerous place under the ground, and they confront the evil inhabitants. And it's really a series of preordained challenges and adventures that lead up to the part in the narrative where the hero twins fulfill their destiny. They avenge the deaths of their fathers, who were the previous generation of hero twins, at the hands of the lords of Xibalba. They sacrifice themselves, and here's the spoiler, which you probably know, they are resurrected and ultimately ascend into the sky to become the sun and the moon. So these hero twins, they transform. They start out as gifted but human boys, but they grow up as a result of their encounters with the forces of evil. They become talented men, skilled magicians, and then eventually immortals. So transformation is a really important theme in all of these things, certainly. And you do see that in the stories as well. Yucatan is not Guatemala, and Quiché and Yucatec Mayan languages are not the same. However, I'm sure that the hero twins would recognize some of the shifting creatures that are still alive in the imagination of the peninsula storytellers. What else? Down figure 6 down here, I know you guys know what a ball court looks like. One of the things that the hero twins do is that, well, they're summoned to play ball with these monsters in the underworld in Xibalba. And then this is a rollout of Justin Kerr's photograph showing the hero twins. They're summoned because the gods and the bad guys in the underworld, they hear somebody make a noise on their roof. It's like when you live in the apartment underneath and you hear noises on top. They're like, what are those noises? Oh, it's those boys again. So they come down to play the ball game with them, which is not a really fun-filled game, but it is definitely an epic battle between good and evil. Anyway, here are a couple of different images showing, let's see, the hero twins defeating this false deity who pretended he was the sun, but he really wasn't. We have one of these bad guys from Xibalba, and you can tell obviously that he is dead because you can see his spine and his bones. And anyway, they're pretty bad down there. We'll get into some of their titles, which are pretty hysterical. Anyway, you know, of course, that one of the features of Yucatan is the many different cenotes. And so one group of stories centers on the magic of the caves and the cenotes and reflects vestiges of ancient beliefs. Caves are seen as the entrances into the underworld, so it makes sense that they would be points of connection to supernatural beings in Maya and other Mesoamerican cultures. In Blood of Kings, the authors Linda Sheely and Mary Ellen Miller stated that the ancient Maya universe was composed of overworld, middle world, and underworld. And of course, the latter was entered by means of a cave or through bodies of standing water, such as an ocean or a lake. In the Popol Vuh, the episodes alternate between things that take place below and above the ground. And so that symbolizes the linkage between agricultural and human life cycles. And it's a process that Tedlock poetically translates as sowing and dawning. In an earlier translation of the book, Ralph Nelson describes how the hero twins Hunahpu and Ishbalanque are summoned to play ball under the ground with the horrific lords of death, and how they traveled down steep stairs and came to the banks of a river that flowed swiftly through jicaro trees. Well, of course, Yucatan is super unique with its geography, the karst landscape, with the many different cenotes. There aren't any rivers on the surface of the ground. And since rainfall has always been a critical issue, people have settled around wherever the cenotes were. And archaeologists continue to find evidence that supports that this has been so for many hundreds of years. The cenotes then are sources of life, and they're also connections to the other parts of the cycle. The whole area, Maya area, is characterized by dry caves, and certainly offerings are still being discovered in caves and cenotes throughout the Maya zone today. And here, just as counterpoint, I just feel compelled to tell y'all that I have been reading about Pueblo people in New Mexico, and in their mythology, it's very interesting. Apparently, the people emerged from the underworld that was a friendly place, and that's how they inhabited this level. It's not a friendly place in the Mayan story at all. So the hero twins go down there and they have to confront all kinds of terrible lords of death. I mean, there's Scab Tripper, Ripper, and Pus. I forget all of these names. They have these crazy names. Pus Filler and Scab Stripper, and really kind of gruesome names for each of these different lords. It's interesting. It's not a fun place. Here they are, the hero twins, playing the ball game. Again, a ceramic rollout photo from Justin Kerr. And if you go to Balanconche Cave, you can still see offerings being made in pots. Of course, the offerings take the form mostly of incense these days. Another thing that's connected with the caves and the underworld is the concept of wind. And aside from being a natural feature of every land, somehow the winds are seen as they're connected to malevolent forces, supernatural entities, and they are in part considered as groups of symptoms that make up or perhaps cause diseases. And the concept of winds exists in a generalized form and also as separate and kind of semi-personalized winds that are in turn connected with wells, caves, and water in general. When I conducted fieldwork in Mexico, in Yucatan, I was always cautioned about coming in contact with evil winds. And these are said to linger at sites where Mayan ceremonies would have invoked a Mayan deity or supernatural entity, like a rainmaking ceremony held out in the woods or whatever. I think it's to do with a power imbalance, like those deities come, supernaturals, I'm not sure what we should call them, they come through and they're so powerful that it can have a negative effect on a person who happens to stumble through there. Okay, here's the names of the gods. When the hero twins go down to Xibalba to play ball with the horrible gods, there's 1 death and 7 death, and there are a bunch of them down there. Blood Gatherer, Skull Scepter, great names. And these characters create specific sicknesses in humans. They cause lesions, jaundice, emaciation, edema, stabbing pain, and sudden death from vomiting blood, according to Tedlock. And the lords of Xibalba also have animal messengers, such as bats and owls, who are nocturnal, and they send these critters up to the surface of the earth, and they fly up through the caves in the cenotes. So, Blood Gatherer, for one of the lords of Xibalba, he sends the owls to take his daughter, Blood Moon, away to be sacrificed. He does this because he realizes that she's pregnant and she has conceived the hero twins by means of an immaculate conception, but he's really angry, so he tells the owls to take her away, and they have mercy on her. It's kind of a Snow White story, really. The owls take the maiden away, but they don't bring back her heart. They bring back the sap from a croton tree. And that is sort of like the beginning of palm incense in the Mayan world, supposedly. So how do the owls do this? They send Blood Moon up through a hole in the earth, and then they go back down below. So the lords of the underworld of Xibalba are horrible, but they're kind of dumb because they're easily tricked. And they're tricked throughout the Popol Vuh too. And part of what makes the hero twins so special is how clever they are and how they manage to outwit the forces of evil. About birds. Colonial era texts like the Quiché Manuscript say that illnesses in that time may have been associated each with their own tree and with their own bird. And certainly people in Yucatan today will tell you that owls and other birds perching on their homes is a bad omen, and that owls especially announce illness and death. Caves are basically a kind of a liminal space. It's a place, a portal in between worlds. So it would make sense, again, that you would see, this is where you would come in contact with disease-causing forces. And caves also are said to be the natural habitat of unusual, if not downright ferocious or fearsome creatures. And they often provide the setting for stories that involve various kinds of transformations, lots of shape shifting going on. So I want to tell you a couple of stories of modern modern stories that have to do with the underworld, the cenotes, the caves that connect our world to it, and some of the associated creatures. Two of these stories that I'm going to tell you describe trips to mysterious places underneath the waters of cenotes. And in both of them, the numerous lords of Xibalba have kind of been replaced and merged into a single Christian style devil. Okay, so this first story was told to me by a very dear friend, Benjamin Burgos. It goes like this. The cenote in Shokan is called Yok Sonot. It is a cenote that steals people. Two married women were stolen. One day, they sat admiring their wedding rings on the bank when one of the rings fell down into the water. One of the women tried to grab it as it sank, but she fell in instead, and she pulled the friend in after her. The two women were not seen again. Years later, after the town had given up on ever seeing those women alive again, an enterprising gentleman had the good idea to go and search the cenote. So he dove down into the water, and there he saw the two ladies, and they were seated in a chamber beneath the cenote, and they were busy combing the devil's hair there. The diver left them alone, entered another part of the underground rooms through a hole in the ground, carrying with him a supply of roasted fish. He found the rings along with a treasure trove of articles. What's happened to this? Here we go. He found the rings and a bunch of other goodies that had been lost in the waters over the years. The diver starts filling up his sack with loot, but when he tried to run away and leave that secret place, the devil's dog starts to chase him. And he ran as fast as he could go. And each time a dog would get close to him, he'd toss like a chunk of the roasted fish over his shoulder, and the dogs would stop long enough to eat the fish. So that's how he escaped. He managed to escape with the treasure. Afterwards, the priest came and blessed that cenote, and there haven't been any more stories about missing people or lost belongings ever since. So that's the first one. Next story. This is called Turtles in the Cenote, and this is my drawing of the turtle at the bottom of the well. Again, this is told to me by a dear friend, the late great Eleuterio Potya, and also I found a written version that was pretty much parallel as well by a guy called Fulgencio No. About 150, 200 years ago, there was a very powerful witch named Jacinto I, and he lived in the town of Shokan. The people there say that on one occasion he entered the depths of the cenote called Yotzonot, and he came out in the other cenote at Chichen, the one that they call Tolok or Shtochim. Jacinto I went in there because two girls had fallen into the water while trying to retrieve their gold rings. Jacinto I, who was a transforming witch, he turned himself into a turtle and he swam down to the bottom of the water at the cenote. At the very, very bottom, there's a passageway that leads into another world. So Jacinto I goes down there. He asked the other turtle that guarded the other side of the passageway if he could have permission to cross to the other side. And they say that the devil lived over there. Anyway, that's where he found the girls. The girls gave the rings as proof that he'd been to that place, but then the devil didn't want to let him go. So when I tried to leave, the devil's dogs gave chase. He tossed them one of the 6 roasted fish that he'd bought before he descended to that place. When the dogs would stop to eat the fish, he would hurry on ahead. When the dogs finished eating, they'd come after him again, and then he'd throw them a little more fish. And so in this fashion, he went on ahead to the surface of the earth. When he ran out of fish, he tossed the gourd container that he'd used to carry them. When Jacinto I finally came out above ground, he turned himself into an ant, and then he hid under some rocks where the dogs couldn't find him. He came out in the Tolok cenote at Chichen, and they say that he came walking back to Shokan 3 days later. I myself have seen the rings he brought back with him. He wears them around his neck on a gold chain, and they're engraved with the initials of those girls that went missing. Okay, so that's certainly proof that it's true, right? It had to be true. Okay, other folktales. Many, many, many stories describe winged serpents, and some of which are said to live in caves. Of course, the great Mesoamerican deity known as Kukulkan to the Maya and Quetzalcoatl to the Mexica is a feathered serpent. If we go back to part 1 of the Popol Vuh, it talks about in the very, very, very beginning, before there were multiple attempts by the deities to make reasonable human beings who knew how to worship them, there wasn't anything. There was just the sky and the sea. So this was before anything else happened. In Tedlock's words, whatever there is that might be is simply not there. Only the pooled water, only the calm sea, only it alone is pooled. Whatever might be is simply not there. Only murmurs, ripples in the dark, in the night, only maker, modeler alone, sovereign plumed serpent, the bearers, the begetters are in the water, a glittering light. They are there, they are enclosed in quetzal feathers in blue-green. So this mythical feathered serpent obviously unites elements of air, earth, and underground in a wonderful way. I have a short story for you that focuses now on the linkage between the serpents, the underworld, and the sky. Again, this one told to me by a really dear and departed friend, Don Benjamin Burgos. So I'm trying to make it sound the way he told me as we walked around in the woods. In this area, there are some very large serpents. They are called Kankuch Kabaob that really kind of resemble a boa constrictor, but they're not exactly like that either. They're truly enormous, and this is a fact that's mentioned in many books. The serpents get very big because they live for a long time. At 50 years of age, they enter caves and grottos to keep growing in seclusion. Once they're down there in the cool depths of the bottom, they have no reason to leave, so they just stay there. They say if the serpents do emerge, they can even eat people because they've gotten so big. Within their caverns, the serpents stay another 50 years until they reach the age of 100. When they complete a century, they begin to sprout feathers. When they feel that they can fly, they try out their new wings. They only emerge in the month of September. Each fall, the serpents may go out to ramble through the clouds if they feel their wings are hard enough. This is true because there are those who have seen it. It's not just imagination, it happens. The serpents have risen up to fly through the clouds. Okay, there's lots and lots of serpent stories. There's lots and lots of flying serpent stories. And I feel compelled also to tell you a short version of a personified wind story. Again, I've heard multiple versions of this story. I translated one from the Spanish. It's called Little Whirlwind, and this is based on a story by Maria Luisa Góngora. And basically, there's a family of whirlwinds, and they live in a cave. The father, strong whirlwind, the mother, lady whirlwind, and the baby, the son, was little whirlwind. The hunters who happened by their cave heard the frightening sound of the wind churning around inside, and so they abandoned that place. Time passed, and one day Strong Whirlwind said, "You know what? I need to get out of here. I need to know what's out there on the earth." So the dad goes out and he spins around and he tears up the neighborhood because he twirls around and he's stronger and stronger and stronger. And he gets to where his forces are leaving him and he turns into a little breeze that gets lost in the sea. In the meantime, Lady Whirlwind's back at the cave and she says, "I'm going to go look for your dad." And so she goes out. She says, "You stay home, you're little." But she goes out and she starts to tip over the boats when she comes to the shore. And she pulls the clothes off the lines as she twirls along. And she really was enchanted by the ocean. So when she goes out over the water, she gets more and more powerful. She gets bigger and bigger. And she gets really big, but then she's also gotten pretty far from land, and then she realizes she doesn't know how to get home. Okay, then she finally finds her way back, And now she's a big, powerful storm. And in Spanish, her name was Hilda. And this was in the year of 1955 that she came, and it was in the month of September. She was looking for her house, and many people died because of her. She never did find her little baby whirlwind, and she never found her home cave. She just looked around until she too died. So to me, this is really interesting because it's kind of like the winds and the caves get connected to hurricanes and the sort of tremendous power that you would see from the storms that come in the late summer. Anyway, little whirlwind, he's home alone in his cave, and guess what? He gets bored too, and he decides he needs to go out too. He gets bigger and bigger and bigger. He's looking for his mom and dad, and he spins around, and he drags the water of the sea, and he inundates the houses that are on the land. And he is playing and playing and playing, but people stop calling him Little Whirlwind. They start calling him Gilbert. And that was the year of 1988, also in the month of September. Finally, the men of the Maya land went to go get the Mayan priests, the men, to ask Little Whirlwind to go home. And so the priest said that with enough offerings of food and with the proper prayer, Little Whirlwind would go home, and so he did. When he noticed the smell of the food that was offered to him, he followed that scent. The owner of the wind recovered the air that had been stolen from him. The owner of the rain got back his water gourd, and the rain went away. And when Little Whirlwind heard his name invoked by the priest, he found his way home to his cavern where he lived. And he noticed that he was very, very sleepy. So he went to bed down in his cave and he slept. When I passed by the entrance of the cave the other day, I heard him still snoring there. So that's my wind story. So we've got winds and we've got serpents, and there are other kinds of beings that live under the ground in the Mayan conception of things. You guys in Yucatan, you probably have heard about aluches, little elves, little miniature, kind of malign leprechaun-like creatures. It's not really a good translation here, but they look like men, but they are not. They are part of a larger hierarchy of the Yunsilop, the supernatural guardians of the fields and the crops and the domestic animals. So, like the European counterpart, these guys have to be propitiated. You have to give them food and drink so that they will help you and rather than harm you. And if you mess up or neglect them, then that can be bad too. I translated a story here called Aluches of Chuburna, which is probably in your backyard. Chuburna is what, just north of Merida or just north and west? North and west? I think that's right. Okay, so here goes. In the past century, the town of Chuburna consisted of some 40 houses, all made of wood and thatched with palm leaves and inhabited by just a few families. Chuburna was at that time separated from the city of Merida by kilometers of uncultivated monte, and the inhabitants dedicated themselves to agriculture. The area was heavily wooded, and there were then, as there are now, a large number of caves, some big and deep and others smaller. The story goes that in the center of the town was a big cavern with many recesses, and the children of that time used to play hide and seek there. The old people say that on Tuesday and Friday nights, the various little elves, the aluches, used to come out from their hiding places to amuse themselves at the expense of the townsfolk. What they would do is they whistle, they would throw rocks at people, they would go into kitchens and they would hide utensils and they would play with food. Now you know where the other sock goes, right? You know, you're always looking for the one missing sock. It's probably the aluches. Anyhow, the aluches caused so much fear that people in the area began to say the community was bewitched. So they, couldn't put up with all of this mess anymore. So they called in the priest, the best men in the area, and they asked him to make a ceremony and offering to dispel these elves. So they do this, and the command declares that the region had been bewitched, and they determined the reason why was that the first settlers had been making offerings and taking care of these little beings in order to get a good harvest. But as the old people died off or changed residence, the children that became adults didn't believe in that stuff anymore. And so they stopped giving the offerings, and the Aluches started to feel neglected. And once they started feeling neglected, that's when they started to do bad things again. Anyway, years go by then, and Chuburna continued to grow until it pretty much merged with the capital. More settlers came to the area, and they built more permanent, fancier houses of mamposteria, the stonework with the stucco on top. They cleared the forests, and they added paved streets. And all of this activity, it kind of roused the little elves from their long slumber. Once again, they started playing tricks on the locals. The families were afraid to go out on Tuesday and Friday nights again, in spite of the fact that now they had electric lights. They could hear the Alushas whistling to each other outside their homes. And on Wednesday and Saturday mornings, when they would go outside, they often found that their belongings had just been scattered all around the town or just hidden completely. Some neighbors claimed they had seen the Aluches. The little beings were like small people. They agreed that they had seen 4 of them. One man had been brave enough to follow the Aluches, and at midnight he said he watched as he entered one of the big caverns, just where he and his relatives had played when they were kids. This story is told so much that nobody goes near that cave anymore. Anyway, you can still supposedly hear those eerie whistling sounds coming out of there at night. But time passed, more years went by, and once again the little people were forgotten. The town continued to grow, and now almost all the houses were made of cement. The inhabitants constructed schools, parks, paved streets, and Chuburna became just one more colonia of the city of Merida. As the population was mostly Catholic, the people asked the Archbishop of the capital to build a church. Surveys were made, and guess what? Strangely, they chose the very spot over the cave where the Aluches were to build the church. Nobody objected. The earlier generation had already passed, and the old stories had been forgotten. So then when the construction crew went to lay the foundation for the church, the workers found 4 niches in the depths of the cavern below, and they found that there was a little Alush sleeping in each one of them. When the people raised the alarm, the elves were removed carefully, and they said that they seemed just like sleeping dolls. The people once again sought out the services of the Mayan priest, the Ximénez, who advised them to return the elves back to their tombs. The people poured cement over them, and that's where they are now to this day, nevermore to awaken. The construction of the church is finished, and it remains the religious center of the place. Traveler, if by chance you visit Chuburna, take note of the church under which the Aluches lie buried. That's what my friend told me, whether it's true or not. Not everything is totally malign underground. I have a love story to tell you now. I find that these are not very common at all. But this one, called The Princess and the Warrior, is pretty well known in the peninsula. I have written down oral versions of it, and I have found various versions of it in books as well. Okay, so this is called The Princess and the Warrior. Effie Luz Vasquez Lopez has a wonderful version of this in Spanish. So what I've tried to do is take my notes and make a kind of a composite between those and the written versions of the story. Okay, so the princess, Lolha is her name. She was the only child of great Nachikokum, the lord of Sotuta. From the time that she was a baby in her cradle, her hand had been promised in marriage to a great lord from a neighboring kingdom. In those days, it was common for parents to arrange marriages of children, and Nachi Kokum took pains to ensure a royal husband for his beloved daughter. The union was going to be beneficial to everybody in the kingdom because it would unite the kingdom's and it would be great politically. Lolha grew up to be a lovely girl. She was willowy and elegant and had immense black eyes. Her mouth was always smiling, and the sound of her singing enchanted her father and the other residents of the palace each day. But Destiny had other plans. Destiny arranged that this highborn maiden would meet the paladin of her father's forces, the warrior Balam Chak, whose accurate lance had pierced the hearts of hundreds of enemies of the Lord of Sotuta. Balam Chak had been honored on many occasions. He was gallant, he was loved, he was respected, and anyway, they fell hopelessly in love. Lolha fell in love with Balam Chak, and the two lovers knew they weren't going to be allowed to marry. The father, Nachi Kokum, the Lord, was a man who prided himself on never going back on his word. And Lolha was betrothed to somebody else. So the young lovers decided to make the painful decision to run away. One moonless night, accompanied only by the cry of the puhui bird, the two young people slipped away through the jungle. And they thought they were heading towards happiness and good fortune. But hidden somewhere in the darkness, there were some people watching with evil intent. And they went and they denounced the flight of the lovers to the dead. And so the Lord, Nachi Kokum, again, honor and pride were really important to him. Over everything else, he ordered that the two lovers should be followed, taken prisoner, and returned to him. Well, there was only just one other person in the kingdom that knew about the young lovers and who actually approved of their decision, and that was No Shunan, which in English would be old maiden. No Shunan was the wet nurse and the caretaker of the princess. This old lady possessed supernatural powers, and she only used them for the good of those around her. When her young charge had first informed her of her plan to run away with the warrior Balam Chak, No Shunan gave the two her blessing. Without telling them, she also decided she was going to follow them in the form of a firefly so she could watch over and protect them in their flight. So No Shunan sees the Lord's bailiffs closing in on the sweethearts, and she turns herself back into a human. And she tells the young people, oh my gosh, you've got to take cover. You've got to hide. Where? Of course, in a cavern nearby. So inside ran the fresh and crystalline waters of a river. But Nachi Kokum's men were excellent trackers. They were used to tracking game through thick woods, and they supplied game for their master's table, and they discovered the footsteps that went to the cavern. It took them about 2 seconds. Well, No Shunan saw that danger was imminent, so she went inside the cave, and in the presence of the lover, she pronounced a magic spell. Her words caused the waters of the Cenotes to spin around and rise up, inundating everything in its path. Then, as the murmur of the liquid returning to its bed was heard, a beautiful pair of sculptures suddenly appeared where the lovers had just been standing. Lolha, with her long hair wrapped around her torso, was frozen in place, as if emerging from the waters with her arms stretched out. Balam Chak looked like a descending god with his petrified arms reaching down to his beloved. And they say that over the course of time, when those stones do manage to touch, that the two, Lolha and Balam Chak, will be free to enjoy their love with the blessing of the spirits of the cave and all the gods of the Mayan land. So this is them. And if you go to Loltun, you can see the two lovers, and they haven't quite been reunited. It might take a few more thousands of years, who knows, but eventually they'll be reunited and then released. Not all evil beings are confined, below ground. Certainly, there are also stories about the Ishtabai, which you may have heard about this character. She is a beautiful but evil supernatural seductress, and she lurks around at night, usually near a ceiba tree. And here, I would point out that ceiba trees usually grow near cenotes with the roots going down, searching for the water. So anyway, she usually hangs out near a ceiba tree, and she waits to beckon men who might be out wandering around. It's kind of a morality story because she calls these guys like, oh, hey, hi, how are you? And like she's, a seductress. And when they come, she either makes them go crazy or she kills them or does various terrible things to them. Um, Roaming around at night is not something that is encouraged in rural parts of the peninsula. And so a man out roaming around at night is seen as, up to no good. And certainly out in the woods is where a lot of kind of illicit love affairs take place. So there's this character, the Ishtabai, that's out to punish this bad behavior. In some cases, she seems really clearly to have been conflated with a Christian devil and Christian hell. So she's this gorgeous woman. She hangs out in a tree. She may float instead of walk. And some stories say, well, that's because she has one goat foot and one turkey foot. So she has a hard time walking, but she's not really walking. She's kind of, levitating over the ground. She lures the unsuspecting guy off into the woods, and he thinks, wow, she really likes me. But no, she does not. She could turn into a monster, sometimes with serpentine characteristics, sometimes thorny arms. She kills him outright, or she drags him to hell. One story that I was told, it's really pretty kind of funny. The man is really, really drunk, and maybe it's an excuse for his behavior. He sees this beautiful woman, and the Ishtabai has taken the form of his wife. So the guy thinks he's following his wife. It's partly justification or something. So his wife says, would you come here, follow me, I want to show you something. And so he goes off further and further into the woods, following the woman that he thinks is his wife. And then the Ishtabai leads her victim to a house. And when they go in, he notices it's like really, really hot in there. And the people have these horribly disfigured faces, and they're burning up. And finally, he manages to escape. The person who helps him escape is an old man in this story who is called just the owner of the winds. And he basically gives this guy a second chance. And he renounces alcohol. He goes back to his wife. He apologizes, and he's never troubled any further by alcohol or by the Ishtabai. Another version of the Ishtabai story is that she can turn into a snake if she is pursued. It's a specific snake called the Chai Khan. So she can manifest herself as an evil wind. She can turn into a snake and get away. So like one version of the story has the son is the one that's captured by the Ishtabai, and he manages to get away because his father helps him. And his father says, okay, well, tomorrow morning we're going to go back out there and we're going to look for the place where that monster was. And all they find is a snake. Anyhow, all manner of transformations abound in the long and rich Mayan literary tradition. Whether the protagonists are good, evil, or morally ambivalent, you can see this business of transformation in contemporary written and oral literature from the peninsula. And it's definitely easy to see the continuity of traditions that go back, way back to the time of the Popol Vuh, the written versions in alphabetic text, and probably well before that. Yucatan is a magical land in many respects. Its unique karst geography provides an unusual number of connecting points between the earthly and otherworldly realms, and the literature from the peninsula reflects just that. So, end of story.
Very good, Marianna, thank you. We'll have time for some questions.